What's up, guys? Welcome to another video. It has unfortunately once again been a long time since I made one of these, but here I am, and today is an exciting day. Today we are talking about the new M1 Pro and M1 Max MacBook Pros from Apple. I just received my new M1 Max MacBook Pro from Apple just a few weeks ago, and I have been using it for work consistently over the past few weeks, and I am amazingly impressed. I am absolutely blown away once again. 2 years ago, I got the 2019 16-inch MacBook Pro, and that really impressed me off the bat, but over the course of a couple years, I definitely ran into hiccups, I ran into problems, complaints. So when these came out and got the rave reviews that they got, I couldn't help myself but to go ahead and order one. And now, having used it for the past couple weeks, I could not be happier. This is an amazing machine for all sorts of content creation, and especially in my case for music production and mixing and anything that has to do with audio. Alright, so let's get into the details. So the machine I got is the 16-inch MacBook with the M1 Max chip, with the 16-core neural engine, 10-core CPU, and 32-core GPU. I got 64 gigabytes of unified memory and 2 terabytes of storage. So I kind of maxed it out, except for the storage. I know that many people are going to say that the 32-core GPU is very much overkill for music production needs, and that is definitely true. I decided to go for that upgrade because I do a bit of animation with After Effects and video editing with 4K and 8K footage, so I figured getting that bump on the graphics card would help my workflow overall in those areas. But definitely for music production, you do not need that GPU upgrade. But that's the machine I got, and of course, a large majority of my day-to-day work is audio and music production. So the first thing I did to sort of test this computer as soon as I got it was I opened up a session that I remember being particularly difficult on my previous 2019 16-inch MacBook Pro. This was a session of a song called Calling Me, and it just had a lot of heavy plug-in processing, a lot of virtual instruments, a really heavy mix and master bus at the end of the chain with 2 limiters with oversampling. It had a lot of overkill stuff, basically, that I could have simplified and committed to make things smoother. But I finished the song without doing that, and basically, on my previous 2019 MacBook Pro, this song could not play at all. Even at the maximum buffer size in Logic, it could just not play. As soon as I press play, 1 second later I would get system overload. So I thought a good real-world test right off the bat would be to just open up that session and see how it goes. So after successfully installing and updating all the software I needed, I'll get to all that in a minute, I opened up this session and pressed play and just see what happens.
I fell in love once on the ocean side. Someone's falling.
Sure enough, it played smoothly and perfectly at 256 buffer size in Logic, which is the buffer size I usually work at. Now, here's where things get a little bit interesting. I noticed that although it did play, the computer was working pretty hard. When I open up the CPU meter, the meters are pegging pretty high. And this was running Logic in native M1 mode. You can also run Logic in Rosetta mode. So then, just out of curiosity, I closed Logic, changed it over to Rosetta mode, and opened up the session again. Now, when I pressed play with Logic in Rosetta mode, the session once again played smoothly, and the computer wasn't working nearly as hard. Open up the CPU meters, and they're not pegging nearly as high as they were in native mode.
Water's glowing. I fell in love once on the ocean side. Someone's falling, and you were calling.
Let me take a step back here and explain a little background here for those of you who don't know so much about the M1 and Rosetta deal. So basically, as you probably know if you're watching this, Apple is now making their own chips, Apple Silicon M1, M1 Pro, and M1 Max chips. Previously, all Apple computers ran on Intel chips. So all the software out there that is available for Mac is built for Intel chips. Software developers have now had to re-engineer their software to work natively on the M1 chips, and a lot of software developers are not quite there yet. So what Apple has done, which is really smart and really helpful to make this transition smoother, is they have integrated a system called Rosetta 2, which allows Intel-engineered software to run on an M1 chip. So basically, as a music producer who uses a lot of plugins and software that is not yet engineered for native Apple Silicon, this allows me to run all my sessions just like I used to, even though there's lots of stuff that's technically incompatible with M1. So, as I mentioned, Logic has an option to open the application in Rosetta mode, which basically means open the Intel version of Logic as opposed to the M1 version of Logic. So you can use both. You have both options. If you open the M1 version of Logic, you can still run plugins that are running through Rosetta, but it has to run each plugin through Rosetta and convert it to be able to run on the M1 computer. But if you open Logic in Rosetta mode, the whole application, along with all the plugins in it, run in Rosetta, so it doesn't have to convert each time you open a plugin. So what I discovered in that moment when I opened up that session with Logic in Rosetta mode is that if you are using a bunch of plugins and virtual instruments that are running on Rosetta that aren't yet made natively for M1, everything runs much smoother if you actually open Logic in Rosetta mode. I noticed that making the computer run each plugin individually through Rosetta worked the computer a lot harder than just opening Logic in Rosetta mode. What's pretty amazing about this, what this proved, was that running Logic in Rosetta mode in the Intel version of the application on an M1 Max computer ran much faster than the same exact setup on my 2019 16-inch MacBook Pro, which was also maxed out. So even running Intel software on the new M1 Max MacBook Pro is significantly faster than running that same software, same project on the 2019 MacBook Pro. That's pretty amazing. Think about that. Imagine once all that software is built natively for M1, how much better it's going to get. That's what's really, really exciting to me. So before we get into any further testing, I want to address a big topic that's really important when it comes to talking about these new M1 chips and music production, and that is software and plugin compatibility. This was one of the biggest reasons I was a little bit hesitant to get one of these machines in the first place. There's a lot of unknowns. At this point, a lot of software has caught up. A lot of audio software is officially supported on either native M1 or through Rosetta. But there is still a bunch of stuff that is technically not supported at all. There are a lot of plugins I use that don't have any info on M1 compatibility from the developer at all. So that was a little bit scary, but I took the risk, and I'm happy to report that every single piece of audio software, plugin, virtual instrument works flawlessly. I've had no issues. Again, a bunch of the stuff does have new M1 versions, so I've downloaded and updated all my plugins to the newest versions that do support M1 or M1 through Rosetta. But a bunch of the stuff is not technically supported, so what I did was just update to the most recent version possible and hope for the best. And I was kind of surprised to see that everything works totally fine, even the stuff that is not technically supported. Some of the developers even say specifically on their website that their software is not yet supported. But everything works totally fine, and again, I've been working on this machine for almost a month now, a few weeks, and I've run into no issues. And I use pretty much most of the major plugin manufacturers out there. You can see a list of all the stuff I use. Again, everything in this plugin list that you see here works perfectly. I've had no issues. So that was a huge moment of relief for me. When I got this machine and updated and reinstalled everything and saw that everything worked, man, I was so relieved. So to all you music producers out there who are worried about compatibility, at least from my experience, it is not a huge worry at all. One thing to keep in mind if you are going to upgrade is that when you are trying to activate and install plugins that are running through Rosetta, you have to open Logic in Rosetta mode, then go to the plugin manager and scan and activate plugins with Logic in Rosetta mode. If you try to activate them with Logic in its native mode, they will fail the activation. So make sure to open Logic in Rosetta mode when trying to activate and scan Rosetta plugins. So just for fun, to see how powerful this computer really is, I did some stress tests. So the first test I'll show you here is a session that I built to use Logic in its native mode. So I use plugins and virtual instruments that are running natively on the M1 chip. I made a track with the Logic instrument Alchemy, a Channel EQ, FabFilter Pro C2, and a Valhalla vintage reverb, and then just duplicated that a bunch of times until I saw the computer start to struggle. And I was able to get 80 tracks of this running simultaneously. Alchemy is a pretty CPU intensive virtual instrument, so that is really impressive. I ran this same exact test on my 2019 MacBook Pro and was only able to get about 50 tracks. So then what I did was I opened the same session with Logic in Rosetta mode, so running all the plugins through the Intel structure. And with that I was able to get 63 tracks. So still really impressive, but as you can see, not quite as crazy as running everything natively. So the next thing I did was I made a session only using virtual instruments and plugins that run through Rosetta. So I made a track with Contact and then a few plugins that I know for sure are running through Rosetta. And by the way, you can tell that a plugin is running through Rosetta for sure if you open Logic in its native mode, add that plugin to a track, and then look at Activity Monitor. You'll notice something called AU Hosting Compatibility Service. And that means that that plugin is running through Rosetta in order to be compatible. If you open Logic in Rosetta mode, you won't see that because the whole software is running through Rosetta. So I did the same thing, duplicating this track a bunch of times, and I was able to get 140 tracks running simultaneously of Contact. That is absolutely mind-blowing. Reminder, this is Logic running in Rosetta mode. Again, I did the same test on my 2019 MacBook Pro, and I was only able to get just under 100 tracks, about 98, 99 tracks. That's obviously still crazy, and yeah, my 2019 MacBook Pro was a really powerful machine. I made a video about it 2 years ago talking about how amazing and powerful it was. But there's one huge key difference, and that brings me to my next major point, which is the fan noise. This was a huge complaint of previous generation MacBook Pros, and as a music producer and recording engineer, it's a real problem. My 2019 MacBook Pro, even opening Logic with a couple tracks, the fans would go up like crazy. So running that session with 98 tracks of Contact, the fans were blowing super loud. Any mic in this room would pick up that fan noise. Running 140 tracks of Contact simultaneously on this M1 Mac computer, absolutely silent. I have not heard the fans turn on once. And I've run a lot of heavy sessions, done long days of recording, haven't heard the fans once. I can hear a super quiet hiss from my monitor tweeters. I never used to hear that before because my computer fan would be blowing so loud. And so this also goes along with just the feeling of how smooth the computer is working. Running heavy sessions on my 2019 computer, even if it was playing, I could tell that the computer was working really hard. The fans were blowing, things would get a little glitchy with the graphics, things wouldn't flow as smoothly, everything would just get a little more sluggish. With this M1 Max computer, even when it's on the verge of getting a system overload message in Logic, the computer still feels like it's relaxed and not working hard at all. I can still scroll around freely, I can open other applications, everything just works really smoothly and quickly, even when Logic is at its brink of overloading. So that's something that is a little bit hard to quantify with tests because, yeah, my previous MacBook Pro could also run a lot of tracks, but it just doesn't feel the same. This computer feels so smooth and so easy. Everything just works perfectly and easily, and it just makes me have less worry. I also play on stage with a computer running tracks and everything like that, and I'm looking forward to doing that with this computer because I'll just have a little less fear of something going wrong. With all my previous generation MacBooks, I always had a little bit of fear that something would just go wrong and the computer would crash. And it did happen a couple times, and it's an awful feeling. I want a machine that I can just trust 100%, that I know is doing its job smoothly and easily, and not worry about the computer working too hard. I am not worried about working this computer too hard. It is absolutely incredible. One more thing I want to mention before we wrap this up. I know this video was mostly about Logic. I also use Ableton and Pro Tools, and Ableton is now officially supported on M1 natively. Pro Tools is not yet, but Pro Tools works perfectly. Pro Tools is not even technically supported at all on the new OS Monterey, which these computers ship with. But once again, I've had no issues. I've been running lots of sessions, recording, mixing, and producing stuff in Pro Tools, and everything works totally fine. No issues there. So if you're a Pro Tools user, not to worry, it works great on these machines. Again, Ableton is now officially supported natively, which is awesome. So I know this video probably sounds like I'm just an Apple fanboy and praising, but this is my true, honest, real reaction. I need a machine that can be reliable and not get in the way and just allow me to make music. And that's what this does. So if you're a creator and you're thinking about upgrading, I would highly, highly recommend these computers. All right, guys, that's gonna do it for me today. I will catch you in the next one.